Reuben F. Johnson, military expert, Breaking Defense. Good evening, sir. Great having you on.
Thank you for having me again.
So let's perhaps try and unpack what has been given, or at least pledged, to Ukraine. What kinds of weapons are the most significant? Of course, F-16s aside, I guess.
Yes, there are some F-16s supposedly on the way. I spoke to a colleague of mine in Warsaw today. He was actually not in Warsaw. He was actually on the way to Kiev for some preliminary meetings about how to support those aircraft. That's fairly significant. But I also think it's quite extraordinary that a coalition of NATO countries, including the U.S., have pledged to send 5 more Patriot air and missile defense systems to Ukraine. And then, according to Biden, there will be dozens, and dozens written in inverted commas, I'm not sure how many that means, of the smaller tactical air defense systems like NASAMS, which is a U.S.-Norwegian project, or ground-launched IRIS-T from Germany.
Right. One of the very, relatively interesting phenomenon I'm noticing is that whenever we talk to military personnel or people who are more familiar with military topics, they always describe that the question is not always how much, but also how is it going to be transferred and when. And there's discussion about the EU countries of the NATO ally members potentially taking over the coordination of transferring arms to Ukraine instead of the United States. Do you think that will come into fruition? And what's the thinking behind that?
Well, first of all, it's not a question. I think this has been decided that there will be a new command set up in Wiesbaden, Germany, that will be staffed by about 700 people from different NATO countries that will take over the process that's been handled in a monthly set of meetings of what we've called the Ramstein Forum or the Ukraine Contact Group. So it's going to institutionalize this process of different NATO countries and partners. There's 50 plus nations involved in institutionalize the process of them sending military aid to Ukraine. And in parallel with this, you've probably also heard that NATO will now station a senior NATO official in Kiev. This will be in addition to the NATO liaison office, which has been there for almost 25 years. As a matter of fact, Ukraine was the very first former Soviet republic to have a NATO liaison office. So these are fairly significant moves, and it's as I said, people are saying, oh, this is Trump-proofing the process in case Donald Trump decides he doesn't want to help Ukraine anymore. But it's more about institutionalizing it. And it's not just America, it's all of these nations and our partners.
Right, so and we've been discussing all kinds of military help, but I just wanted to ask you about your assessment of what's happening in Ukraine right now. What's happening on the front lines?
The front lines is a very, very terrible, slow grind with neither side able to have the resources to be able to push through and make any significant gains. The Ukrainians have been able, because they've got better equipment in some cases and better training, and a few of the Ukrainian units are extremely capable. They have been able to make some very small tactical level counteroffensives, but it's positional warfare right now, and it's just terrible. It's the only way. I can't think of a sophisticated way to describe it. But the Russians are losing more personnel than the Ukrainians. And to put it into perspective, in the month of May, the Russians lost 40,000 men. Now, that's half of the British Army in 1 month. And they keep pulling in more recruits, people they can dragoon on the street, people they can pull out of prisons, people that they can somehow hoodwink into serving in the Russian military. But the numbers that they're pulling in month to month are only replacing losses. So their aggregate numbers are not changing. As a matter of fact, they may be even slightly lower with each passing month.
Right, and speaking about the UK, Keir Starmer has reassured Ukraine that they can use the long-range weapons provided by the Brits to attack the Russian territory. I guess we need more such assurances from other countries, or you think it will be unlikely that they will come in?
Well, there's pressure on the United States to allow the Ukrainians to use these weapons to strike any targets anywhere in Russia, which they have not been allowed to do to date. And it's absolutely mind-blowing, because the Ukrainians can see these Russian aircraft on the ground. These are the aircraft that then take off and launch missiles, like the missile which hit that children's hospital in Kiev earlier this week. And this is another example of how we don't set any red lines for Putin, but we set them for ourselves, and it's disastrous.
Right. You mentioned earlier about this term that people have been throwing around, calling Trump-proofing NATO. And I was actually wondering, seeing that the November election is approaching, how much of it is political rhetoric and how much of it is actually, well, it is imperative that NATO bolster its defense spending anyway. So that could be something that be used to kind of push NATO into that direction anyways.
It's rhetoric which will be used to push NATO in that direction. I seriously doubt that Donald Trump is going to try to sabotage NATO or any of these other horror scenarios that you've heard. He's simply the viewpoint of a businessman. He says we've been getting a bad deal in the U.S. because we've been paying more than our fair share, and some of the NATO allies have been paying less. That's the ultimate objective of what he's trying to do. But I just had an article published on the first day of the summit this week that talks about how NATO's interests in Europe are now inextricably connected with the United States and our allies' interests in Asia. You cannot do these in a vacuum. You cannot say, oh, well, Ukraine over here is completely separate and Europe should take care of that, and then we go concentrate on China. No, they're linked. They're all linked. Everybody knows now, the Japanese, the South Koreans, the Taiwanese, everyone knows now that what happens in Ukraine is of immense significance to them.
Right, absolutely. One more question about the importance of the Black Sea, because this military base is being expanded in Romania, the NATO military base. Will we see more such initiatives?
Yes, because the Black Sea for a long time has been a Russian lake. The Ukrainians, with using an extraordinary amount of ingenuity, have managed, here's Ukraine, a country with no navy, has managed to destroy the Russian Black Sea fleet and make their presence in Crimea untenable. So yes, there will continue to be a buildup there, not just for a naval presence, but also for air and missile defense purposes.
Right. Thank you so much, sir, for your input and insight. Really help us unpack this topic a little bit. So really appreciate it.
Thank you again for having me.